Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner.
You joined us here in the Wesley Theatre for the fourth of a short series of winter addresses. I said at the very beginning of this series that maybe winter wouldn't be over by the end of the series, and I was definitely right. Here in Australia, we are experiencing our winter, which thankfully only has a few weeks to go, but it's an important part of the calendar of the year. It's very interesting that may not be as inappropriate a beginning as you might think, because so much of the teaching of Jesus, and essentially the parables of Jesus, focus upon nature itself, from examples that come from the agricultural world time and time again. In our last address, I talked about the parable of the soils, not the sower or the seed, but the soils. And there, all the seed was good seed, irrespective of where it might have gone. It wasn't the seed that was the issue. It was the soil that received the seed that was the issue. But now we have two different kinds of seed. They're sown from different ends of a scale. One from an end where the seed is good, and one from the end where the seed is poor. And the distinction between the two seeds become the focus of Jesus' teaching. An important distinction on this occasion is that seed doesn't represent faith. Let's not get too much where we say this means this and this means that. But clearly it has an application to those early Christian disciples that were hearing the words of Jesus for the very first time, the Christian community that were reflecting upon the words of Jesus as they understood it in their own early challenging days. If the parable that we have before us presses the question, where do we stand? The second question is wrestling with the profound and challenging of issues, which is, what do you do with evil? And how is wrong understood in a world of mixed up responses and mixed up effectiveness? This is something we're always confronted with if we're serious about our discipleship, particularly if we ask ourselves a number of questions. The first is, isn't the kingdom of God about good things and good people? Well, I think the answer to that is essentially yes, but it exposes, unpacks, reveals the fact that that is not the whole story of the reality of living in our world. And why is it, another question, why is the response so mixed? Surely the one who teaches, the Savior, the Son of God, surely people would respond to that. Well, clearly, by the time the gospel is starting to be preached and understood, there were those rejecting it just as they rejected Jesus. That's the problem in every setting and each local setting, whether in the first century or whether in the century in which we live today. It's the chore, the hard effort that is required in weeding. Weeding when it's first heard and in our contemporary settings. Some people have this idyllic view of the church. And an idyllic view of the church eventually causes us real problems. The idea that somehow that it's so good and that there aren't problems with it, usually it's reflecting in an idyllic and an unreal way about some past image or person or personality or congregation or community that once we belonged to. And I understand that being very exciting as we reflect upon it, but it is not like that. The reality in every age, in every place, and amongst all those who are seeking to bring the kingdom of God into people's ears are very, very challenging. The intertwining, if you like, of good and bad, right and wrong, decent and best. And it passes through the heart of every community. And it has a particular challenge for Christian people. We can't externalize the problem and disclaim any kind of personal liability. When Jesus teaches here, he really challenges us as he offers this to us. The parables of Jesus disclose new truth which cannot simply be reduced to statements or conclusions. Generally, they are more than allegories, far more than that, though one or two of them, including the parable of the sower, have something of that about them. But they can and they do disturb. We must be careful not to domesticate the message of Jesus, making it palatable, making it so easily applicable that we can easily look beyond ourselves to the real problems in the world. Jesus' teaching is very direct. Once again, Jesus uses this agricultural setting, familiar to people who heard it in those very early days, who worked in farms and in the agricultural world. And it communicates a deep and profound truth. Many of us live in cities in this lovely country of ours. This is especially true in this country, more than many people outside of it ever really imagine, because so many of us are in the big cities around the country. But when people live in rural settings, don't be surprised that they find it easier sometimes to understand the teaching of Jesus. For so much of his teaching, so many of the pictures, so many of the expressions he speaks of come from that kind of world, not from the concrete jungles that make up our modern cities. I've often thought that people who live there are better connected to really understand what it is that Jesus is talking about. So many of his stories, so many of the lessons, so many of the indicators as to what the kingdom might be all about. In cities, we may be less dependent upon what we ourselves grow. But the interest in horticulture is phenomenal. If you want to go to a garden centre any weekend, you'll find packed with people who have an interest in a world that is probably detached from their world, often idyllic in their minds of a past world, but certainly with phenomenal interest. There are always challenges in dealing with parables, and particularly if you get too intense about one or two details. We need to hear, as many of the great writers on parables, beginning with God and moving into our own present day through people like Jeremiah and other scholars, because parables are not meant to be 50 different messages. One essential, powerful message. So when you read a parable, don't look to try to unpack it and make it allegorical. Just try to find what is it that Jesus is first, last, and all through saying to his people. And in this context here, we have something, therefore, if we do that, that relates to the world in which we live. I find it most helpful to consider the parable in the light of that Jesus is teaching the first early disciples in the earliest days of their discipleship. The whole of the 13th chapter has to, I think, be understood in that kind of way, especially when you relate it to Mark's gospel. It may well have been the first record of these parables as they're presented to us. What does it say to people who were recognizing that there were plenty of weeds as well as wheat growing? That even in the earliest days, Jesus was no longer being received in the synagogue freely and openly. People were closing down those doors. There were disciples who were struggling with their own faith, their own understanding of life. And they were struggling to understand what it was. What does the parable have to say in that particular context might be helpful for all of us. Some people have wrongly interpreted the parable solely in terms of the church, and I think that's a big mistake. How true and false believers coexist until the final judgment. For me, Michael Green, who writes as not simply, but as openly and refreshingly about Matthew's gospel, writes this: but this will not do for two reasons. For one thing, the problem of nominal Christianity did not yet exist. And for another, we're told explicitly that the field is the world. So let's not become introspective in understanding the parable and start talking about ourselves and only ourselves. It's a much larger issue than all of that. I'm always trying to find a way of communicating a parable that I hope makes some sense to a modern reader or listener, without taking away its ability to disturb us. Now, the parables do disturb if we hear them in their authentic setting and don't cover them with some kind of expression that merely makes it a good story to tell about the fact, well, church is just like that. We all know that. We know ourselves, or at least a little of ourselves, enough to know, in fact, that things are not all good. We may, amidst all the excitement of following Jesus, we may become impatient. We may cry, why doesn't everyone believe? Or why doesn't everyone seek the same values or build for a better world? Perhaps we have to wait. And maybe this is the message. We may have to wait until the judgment, the end, when God's kingdom all comes together to begin to seriously have answers to that kind of question. At the outset of these addresses, I pointed to some of the characteristics of Matthew's gospel. And one aspect that somehow captures all his thinking is the way he presents the ministry of Jesus and his teaching in such a practical, through the eye to the heart way. And as we read this parable, just as we did last week, we see something of that happening for those that were listening. Matthew deals with human problems which confront people and communities. We read through Matthew's gospel, just think of the list: anger, hypocrisy, tax, the power of possessions. And so the list goes on. And so many of the parables of Jesus touch on these very practical issues that we have to wrestle with. We may not like what he says, how he presents it. It may well be very challenging to all of us as we understand our own lives. But if we're going to be serious in the business of following Jesus, we have to take it seriously. The parable deals with the weeds that cause such a nuisance. Jesus recounted how a man went out and sowed good seed in the field. During the night hours, when nobody could see, somebody else went out into the field and sowed poor seeds. When the wheat sprouted, the seeds that produced good wheat were to be seen by all. But also at that time was the result of that which was sowed at night by the poor sower of seed. They may well have been tempted to take swift action. As soon as they saw the difference, as soon as there was any real sight of it, let's get rid of those weeds now. Let's get them chopped down. Let's finish with them. But the point that Jesus makes is that they look alike very often. And if you start pulling them out too early, you're very likely going to pull out good seed. You have to wait till the seed has reached its point of harvest. Then the distinction is clear for all to see. For what at first looks very like another ends up looking very, very different. You might have rushed off to the garden centre for some weed killer. You might have thought, this is the way to get rid of it. But as you put the weed killer across them all, so good die as well as bad. Now, the teaching of Jesus is not only challenging, I think it's not only profound, I think it's there for us all to hear it if we did. The advice of the farmer makes good common sense, so our text. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I'll tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and then tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. You see, life can be far from attractive. One of the challenges that Christians face particularly is that of ensuring that we have a realistic view of the world, a realistic view of our friends, a realistic view of the world in which we have to exercise our lives day by day. How many recall if they've ever been into a place where they not only sell plants, it's one of these centres where they have all these lovely quaint sayings that people like to put in their garden. One of the ones is Dorothy Frances Garner says, one is nearer to God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth. Feels kind of nice, doesn't it, really? Well, it's not really biblical Christianity, you know. So much of the teaching of Jesus about gardens and fields and agriculture just contradict that and tell us it can be a very, very difficult place. How many look at that and see the amazing propensity of their own gardens to grow weeds? Are you good at it? We can grow weeds like nobody else. And sometimes without very much effort. The effort is not to grow weeds and at the right time to pull the weeds out. At the right time, not the wrong time. And I hear Jesus speaking very practically. In acknowledging this, we see the relevance of what he's saying. One lesson from our parable could be that the presence of weed should not prevent us from sowing seed. I mean, if we have a bad season and a good season for the weeds, we could say, I'm not going to do it ever again. I think Jesus is saying, no, you should. But you must choose the right time to sort the weeds out. Whether those weeds are in our own lives, whether those weeds are in the community of faith, whether those weeds are in the community around us, don't rush ahead. Notice there's a transitional nature at the end, as in the first parable of the sower. The parable of the weeds has an explanation. And there's a verse that's such an interesting one, verse 36 in Matthew 13. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Now here's something interesting. It tells us at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't it, between 5 and 7 in Matthew's Gospel, that he taught with authority, not as the scribes and the Pharisees did. The common people heard him gladly, but here the disciples didn't get it. So they followed him into this house and said, Jesus, can you give us a few minutes? Explain it to us. We're struggling with this. And I believe lots of us still struggle with understanding what this kind of parable can be saying to us. It's true that both in the Christian community and in the world around us, there are aspects of life which are far from attractive. If you make the assumption that all Christian elders and leaders are essentially good and don't make errors, you're in trouble. If you make the assumption that any organization that has a Christian name or band about it has nothing about it that's fractured, you're mistaken. The reality is that we live in a fractured, broken world, and that can be seen in so many ways around it. And the difference between what is fractured and what is pure is difficult to take. Oh, I understand, Jesus. You're telling a story like that to us. You're showing us that it's very difficult. And it's only when it comes to the end that you'll be able to distinguish between A and B. Only when that happens. Bishop J.C. Ryle was a former bishop of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. He was one of the great Anglican holiness preachers. And he wrote so effectively on the theme. He wrote, the ways and fashions and amusements and recreations of the world have a continually decreasing place in the heart of the growing Christian. He does not condemn them as downright sinful, nor say that those who have anything to do with them are going to hell. He only feels that they have a constantly diminishing hold on his own affections and gradually seem smaller and more trifling in his eyes. And he too is talking about something that is a fruit at the end rather than going in and sorting it all out in an unknown way. The parable calls for a realism about the world and the way we experience life. Life is far from beautiful and is frequently marred by hurt, selfishness and greed by everyone. Not one. This is the broken world in which we live. Far too easy to blame the one that we feel is the blame of all things. But we're part of that world. And only in God's grace can we start to live creatively through forgiveness and grace and peace. Only then can we begin to see the opportunities and possibilities of God. It's the work of the Spirit which makes possible that which is inattainable in our own lives. So let's acknowledge life can be far from attractive. But let's move on. Secondly, weeds grow without a fanfare. Have you noticed that? Weeds just grow quietly. They don't announce they're coming. You come out one morning and they're there and you say, how's that happened? And that happens in so many ways as we start to listen to Jesus talking about weeds. In this parable, we're told that he speaks of weeds that have been sown alongside wheat. It's important to note that it happened at night. Again, you spend a long time, I think, in properly opening this parable by talking about the imagery of night and day and all that that might have to say in terms of God's kingdom. It was only later when the weeds sprout and formed heads. Only at that point could the distinction between A and B be truly seen. Understanding the farmer methods in Israel, Palestine, and indeed much of the Middle East is always helpful to an understanding of the New Testament. There was a common weed at the time known as bearded darnel. And the great thing about this weed, well, not the great thing, the bad thing about this weed, is actually that you can hardly see the difference when it grows. So when Jesus is saying this, he's not telling a story that nobody would understand. For any of these people who lived at the northwestern side of the Galilee, as many of them did from Capernaum and elsewhere, where fields were sown, they would understand the power of the bearded darnel. In the early stages, it was identical to wheat. However, when both had produced seeds, the two were easily distinguishable. Now, the temptation for the farmer was to begin the weeding process too early. Holding back is hard to do, isn't it? When you know something needs to be dealt with, holding back is so important. For only in that way can ultimately the distinction between the two be actually discovered. It would be a foolish mistake to harvest too early in this situation, because you could destroy a good crop. If we take this parable and others like it seriously, we'll grasp the message that in the early stages, evil is hard to distinguish from good. Just look around at some of the evil things that have happened in the world in which we live. And they don't always look that way at the beginning, but gosh, they end up that way. It can be hard to distinguish between good and evil. We must leave God to make the ultimate distinction. And this isn't a case of saying, that man's bad. We're talking about big stuff here. Jesus is lifting us to see the world around us and to recognize in that world that the distinction between good and bad is often hard to find until its fruit is ultimately seen. There's an undeniable link also in this chapter between the parable of the mustard seed and this parable, the mustard seed, the smallest that grows, and only when it grows do we see the real benefits of its fruit. The common link seems to be the power of those things which we don't see, the imperceptible realities of living in the world. So the Apostle Paul reminded us, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. In his notes on Matthew 13, Douglas Hare helpfully pointed out that we must take care in the way that we interpret this passage. One overriding point was secure, and that is, God is at work even though human eyes don't see it. Even if we fail to perceive what is happening. But then, critically and wonderfully, God brings about a wonderful harvest. As we draw to a close, let's take this parable and say this parable isn't just about identifying wrong. It isn't just about removing weeds because the whole garden is full of weeds. It's about recognizing that just as there's a certainty of the presence of weeds in the world around us, in our Christian communities, and in so many other ways, there is an ultimate harvest, and eventually the two will be separated. The two don't have an end because ultimately they're separated. We're confronted with the sudden ambiguity of the world. Just think for a moment of what's been happening in our world in just the recent past weeks and months. Just a few weeks ago, so many of us across the world, in Holland, Malaysia, and Australia, were confronted with that terrible crime that saw the destruction of flight MH17. How do we come to understand the deep-seated wrong that exists in this world? We see it in the Israel-Palestine conflicts that exist, and in the continuing wrong perpetrated on a huge scale. And then we have seen only in recent days the events in Iraq and the responses to them, which also remind us of this ambiguity. Though the answer is difficult to conclude, it's a much healthier position to begin the exploration by not expecting the world to be fabulous, and not expecting the world to be all perfect, and not expecting the world to be full of goodness and no evil in it. Let's start from the realities that it's not. In sound Christian theology, we know that this world is broken and fallen and fractured and destroyed in so many ways by our own sin. So we start from that assumption. Then, thankfully, the gift of Christ for this world makes that which is broken reverberate again with life, brings wholeness and healing and possibility. And when we start to talk like that, we say, hey, Jesus, we begin to understand what you were talking about. When you've told us that story that even the disciples didn't understand, a parable that has power within it. It's a much healthier position to begin there, not by anticipating responses that all was good. We may ask ourselves, where was God in the mess and ruin of that disaster that we now know by the word Ukraine? Where was God in all of that? You may search for the answer to such a question, but I believe the only answer that we can give is that God's grace and his love will always be found in the hearts of grieving people. You want to find where God is? God is found in the hearts that grieve and struggle with evil in the world. Always in the lives of those who are seeking a judgment, not for themselves, but for that which is bigger than themselves, and also found in the concerns of a world trying to understand. The parable of the weeds clearly establishes that it's God who's the ultimate judge of the world. Now, that's not an evil statement. That's not a statement to make people feel. God is the judge of this world. You are not, but he is. That's enormously encouraging, because it takes off our shoulders all the weight of judgment that so easily flows in our assessment of the world. Whenever I preach on the parables, I frequently turn to that man Joachim Jeremiah, so I mentioned just briefly earlier, whose writings I consider to be the best amongst writings on the parables. And once writing on the second and related parable in this chapter, he concluded the section by saying this: till then, all false zeal needs to be checked. The fields must be left to ripen in God's time, in patience, and the net must be cast widely, and everything else left to God. Now, he's actually not softening something. He's sharpening our thinking at that point. So as I draw to a close, I refer again to the one that always makes sense for me on this particular chapter, and that's Michael Green, who points out we take a breath before we hear his words. Parables are not meant to pat us on the back, but to give us a kick in the pants. They're not intended to comfort us, but to challenge us and change us. Parables speak out against the status quo. Parables are demonstrators, waving signs of protest, speaking out against our ways of thinking, our traditional ways of experiencing and obeying God. And I say, thank you, Michael, for waking us up. That when we turn our Bibles open, they're not full of simplistic answers that allow us to become the judge of this world, but they're very clearly that fact that God is the ultimate judge of this world. And on a night when there are far too many tears in the world, when nations and communities bite and bark against each other, thank God he's the judge of the world. When as people and religious people we join in the din, let's be quite clear that that's where the judgment of the world belongs. And Jesus, you told this simple story about the fields. We want to be the people pulling out the weeds out and get them out early. Read the back of the packet, that's what it says. Jesus says, don't get them out early. Wait till they grow and see them for what and who they are. Weeds do come as a nuisance, but we remind ourselves that God is the ultimate gardener.